Welcome back, everyone. Today is Friday. We are going to do a follow-up on my epic failure with technology earlier this week. And Joanne has graciously agreed to rejoin us this morning so that we can take some follow-up questions on her presentation on caregiver burnout. So if you have not had a chance to watch it, please scroll down in our Facebook feed, or you will, in the next hopefully day, be able to link to the YouTube presentation from our website. And you can, it's all pre-recorded, so you can watch it at your leisure. And then if you have questions that we don't either cover in the presentation or cover this morning, then please feel free to reach out to either Joanne or myself directly. You can post comments on our Facebook page. Joanne's contact information is at the end of this presentation and also on her website, www.myblueskycounseling.com. Or just drop me an email and I'll make sure that you get in touch with her. So we want to make sure everybody gets the information that they need on this very important topic. So Joanne, welcome back.
Thanks, Katie.
Thanks for giving up another hour out of your life to talk with us today.
I'm really thrilled to be here.
You know, I watched the presentation this week and I could not help but think myself, I have never been the caregiver to someone recovering from a major illness or major life event like was discussed in the presentation. And so really the closest I can come is when I gave birth to twins and that first 6 to 9 months of their life and my lack of a life. And I certainly, through that, could relate very well to the things that you were describing. And I think that I probably went way past caregiver stress and into caregiver stress, then caregiver burnout. I definitely got into there and every once in a while jumped into the empathy fatigue as well. So I know that it's not the same as the very longer term burden that many of our caregivers face, but at least it gives me a place of empathy to be able to engage in the conversation. And I had help. I mean, I had my mom there supporting me. I had my husband there supporting me, but it's still so many of the things that you talk about in the video about just feeling overwhelmed and feeling like you don't even want to talk to anybody and you want to, friends. I don't have time for that. But one of the biggest things that I felt and that I hear from our caregivers as being something that they feel is guilt. And it comes on so many levels. Guilt for the fact that something tragic has happened to someone that they love and dealing with that grief and loss that goes along with that.
Yeah.
Guilt that they're still functioning just fine and their loved one is going through this. Guilt that they feel tired and overburdened and overwhelmed. Guilt for taking time for themselves is a big one. We tell people all the time that you're in this for the long haul. This is not a sprint. This is a long-term thing that you guys are dealing with. You have to take the time to take care of yourself. And the biggest theme that comes back time and time again is I can't do it. I can't step away. I've had people say, when I took that marriage vow, I committed to being in it, and so I'm in it, and this is on me. I'm doing it, and that guilt or that fear that if they do step away, something bad is going to happen to their loved one because they are the ones that know what's going on. They are the ones that know all of the ins and outs, and so I was hoping that you could speak a little bit about that feeling of guilt that so many caregivers experience and how. Maybe me as a therapist or how you as a mental health professional can help people through that feeling so that they can get to a place where they're able to actually take care of themselves.
Yeah. You speak very well to this feeling of guilt, and it very much is a shared experience. Whether you're caring for a child, or an adult, I mean, it doesn't matter if it's caring for somebody who's had a stroke or traumatic brain injury, or any kind of difficulty in functioning. The caregiver experience it's a universal experience.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's something that we don't know as caregivers, is that this is a universal experience. And so it's interesting when you talk about guilt, because if we look at, and it's interesting because I talk about guilt, which is equal to I did a bad thing. The feeling of guilt is I did a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so we talk about guilt and what's called inappropriate guilt. That where are we carrying inappropriate guilt? Can we question ourselves to say, did I do a bad thing by not doing a thing, by not being there, by not helping to the nth degree? And so I think it's an interesting conversation about helping someone through guilt of I did a bad thing, and where we carry inappropriate guilt, and that burden of inappropriate guilt as part of our personal narrative. But it's interesting. There's another component, and I think I touched on it in the presentation. Is shame.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about guilt and shame. So guilt being I did a bad thing, shame being I'm a bad person.
Right.
Very, very different. And the concept of shame in I'm a bad person, in the, if you will, I'm not enough, because if I was enough, I would be able to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting because this shame concept doesn't get an awful lot of play. It's certainly not a comfortable concept even for us to talk about. But it's a big issue with caregivers, because it's the guilt part. I did a bad thing, or can we question ourselves? Am I really doing a bad thing? And and I'm a bad person. And those two things really go hand in hand in the caregiver experience. And I think, talking with a therapist about it is important, because we don't stop to really deconstruct our feelings about what's really going on there. We certainly don't question ourselves. And we often don't have somebody to question us. And so, working with somebody who can help us with those concepts is really important, because they're shared feelings of all caregivers.
Yeah, for sure.
So, and it's caregiving. It doesn't matter who you're caring for. It can be a very lonely role. Even as you said, if you have help,
mm-hmm.
because usually the caregiver is the primary person in that individual's life, and so you're just all that much closer.
Yeah.
It's also about the relationship and how that caregiving is difficult, but if it's one step remove or two step removes, we can tend to be much more objective. But when we're that close as a parent or a spouse, there's a very subjective piece that we're not able to look at alone.
Mm-hmm.
It's about the relationship, and in that relationship, we can get really lost in some really unhealthy behaviors. And so
we definitely see that in the rehabilitation field, where many times the caregivers take on the burden of the success or failure of a person's rehabilitation program as a reflection on their ability to caregive. And, as a therapist, we're often guilty of, well, I'm just going to give you, all I'm asking is for you to do these 1 or 2 or 3 things at home. Like, that's it. Just can we focus on these 3 things? And so then I say that to them as a physical therapist. And then the occupational therapist says, okay, I just need you to focus on these 3 things at home. And then the speech therapist says, okay, I'm just going to give you these 2 things, but I really need you to do them every day. It's only 2 things. Well, except now this only 2 things or only 3 things has now manifested into 6, 8, 10 things that have become the burden of the caregiver to follow through on if the individual is not able to do it themselves. And right. I think a lot of times caregivers don't feel empowered to say, no, we just can't do this. Mm-hmm. And I want for caregivers to know that that's okay. It's okay when a any PT, OT, rec therapist, speech therapist, cognitive therapist, mental health professional says, well, I just need you to do X, Y, or Z, to say, we can't. This is just too much. And I don't think in the long run it necessarily will mean that a person doesn't recover. I mean, people are going to continue to get better for the rest of their lives. Maybe it affects what happens in the next week or the next month, but the ultimate outcome, it's not going to make or break a rehab program for a caregiver to say, we just can't do this. And I think that's part of the PT patient caregiver relationship too that is often not really addressed. We're looked to as the one that is guiding the program, and so whatever we say needs to happen, and that's simply not true.
Well, it's I think it's such a great conversation about how mental health professionals can work with occupational, physical, speech therapists, working hand in hand, because not only are you managing the emotions, in managing the emotions of a caregiver, there's a big part of this that nobody really talks about, which is acceptance, which is also part of the grief process, because caregivers are also unknowingly, there's not a lot of it, they don't address a lot of their own grief, what's happening. And there are stages of grief in there, from the initial shock of the situation to, there's a whole range of emotions that, we can even do a whole session on that. But the ultimate place we need to arrive at is acceptance. And that's difficult because of, if you want to call it, social constructs, what we learn about acceptance. That if acceptance is something that's positive, it's easier to move to. But if acceptance means giving up, or, I couldn't get there, we keep pushing and pushing up against something that may never be. And so, I think a mental health professional and of course somebody in your role can help with this business of acceptance, not only acceptance of the loved one's situation, but acceptance of yourself in that. And so much of what happens with caregivers has to do with who we were as people before our loved ones event. The messaging we carried about acceptance and perfection, and how we ask for help and what all of those things mean. And so whatever that was before, it gets heightened in the caregiver role.
Yeah.
And so the piece of acceptance is really important. I know it's something I learned, and even though I'm a mental health professional, I'm also, what do they say, first I'm a human, then I'm a counselor. And so I experienced every single one of the pieces that caregivers experience.
Right.
And when you're that close to the situation, you can't even see it. And actually working with professionals to help you do that is important, because the role is, I call it, all in. And in the all in, it's being, I mentioned, it's like being sucked into the vortex, if you want to call it. It doesn't happen slowly. And so there's not a lot of preparation. Working with a professional can help you stabilize those feelings and stabilize that feeling, stabilize those frustrations. But this is very much a problem with caregivers, is that there's difficulty in acceptance, and no one helps caregivers with that wholly. So they take on the responsibility, almost being what's called overly responsible.
Exactly.
And that's a problem. And so one of the things I learned is, in as long as your loved one is cognitively well enough to understand things, even if it's honestly at a very rudimentary phase as they're healing, there's much a caregiver can do to partner with their loved one in ways that we don't see. We see we're supposed to be doing it all. And there's a lot we can do to help that person take responsibility for what they're supposed to be doing, so that we can sort of balance this, if you want to call it, burden. And then it's managing to that expectation that if our loved one doesn't do that thing, the path to acceptance, and that's acceptance of ourself and acceptance of the person in the situation. We often talk about, the other thing I think we get caught up in is what's called potential. That we are a hopeful nation. We tend to look much more to we can surmount every difficulty, if we just try, if we just navigate over around. And that's not necessarily true with recovery. I've learned, everybody's recovery is very individual, and potential is a very funny thing. It really is very much dependent on the individual. But if a caregiver doesn't understand that, they tend to say, okay, it has to be 100%, or it's nothing, or I'm failing, and we take on much more of the burden than we should. And again, these are things I think, if you work with a counselor, they can help you understand these concepts, to kind of back up and get a greater view, a larger view of the situation. And it can lead to greater acceptance in what is, and truly the grief process of, what was lost and what I hoped for. But again, when we're in the role, we don't see that. We just go, like anything else, for some reason, we believe that when we're in it, we're supposed to go further in. If we just do more, if we just keep going, it doesn't work like that.
Well, and in fact, it's interesting because it really needs, from a recovery from a stroke or brain injury or spinal cord standpoint, it really has to be the opposite. That, when an event first happens, the caregivers are often thrust headfirst into this life. And in the very beginning, when the person is so medically fragile and when there's very little that they might be able to do for themselves, that's the time when the caregiver, and that doesn't just mean the loved one, but that's the doctors and the nurses and the therapists and the medical staff. We are often providing that 100% support and structure for a person. But as that person leaves the hospital and goes home and continues on their recovery journey, that responsibility is supposed to shift. And, in the beginning, the person is hospitalized, maybe they're unconscious. Well, 100% of their roles get taken away from them. Their role immediately changes from being, provider for the family or head of the household or whatever it is, to your job right now is to live, is to, get past this initial crisis. And so then all of those roles get divided up amongst the caregivers. Often they all get piled onto one person. But as that person recovers, one of the biggest things that we strive for in therapy is to get that individual to take ownership of their own recovery. And so part of what has to happen in order for a person to own their own recovery is they have to start taking some of their roles back, which means the caregiver also has to be willing to give up some of those roles. And it's always surprising to me how difficult it is for caregivers to give up those roles. And I guess it really shouldn't be, because often what it means to give up a role as a caregiver is initially you have to actually do more work, because you have to allow the person the time to struggle, maybe even the time to fail, so that they can learn from that. But then you as the caregiver are there in the background sort of double checking or adding more time. So now I'm getting this message saying that something's having trouble playing the video. Gracious sakes alive. So let's see if we're still on here. I am cursed on this Facebook Live, I think.
I've seen a few people use it. It takes a long time to work out the kinks.
Well, it says that I'm still going, so I don't know. It says we're still on, so we're going to go with it.
But you have a really good point in that, as long as your loved one is cognizant, it's really important to communicate out that one of the things I learned, and I can't tell you the source of how I learned it, was that I started to communicate with my loved one who had a stroke that this is not just your stroke, that this is our stroke. So what it did, I think, well, is shifted from I am not wholly responsible for this, that you're responsible, that we are a team.
Yep.
And this is our stroke, and that your stroke is my stroke. What affected you affected me, and we both have roles in this, and that this is, I can't carry this for you, and you can't carry this alone. That I can, if you will, walk beside you.
Mm-hmm.
I think as caregivers, the problem is we stop walking beside immediately. Before the loved one's event, we are walking beside largely, and then now all of a sudden we're so intertwined. And it's how to get, if you will, extrapolated from that without the guilt, to know that what you do well for your loved one is when you partner with them.
Right.
And there we go. And I think, when you think about caregiving, and what again, there's a lot of social construct, what we learn about loving somebody, if you will, and caring for them is, and we think about children from the time that they're born, they need us. There's an incredible need. There's an incredible dependence. And sometimes after our loved one has had a health event or they're in decline, we kind of go back in our head to that piece, that there's nothing that they can do for themselves. And we get ourselves in a lot of trouble. And quite honestly, we don't do our loved one any favors, because we're sort of unknowingly taking away their dignity.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely.
So it's this idea of, I think if we can communicate out that whatever it is ours and not yours or mine, we do better in that piece. Because we can back up from every single thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's a particularly difficult situation when you're just that much closer. But I did find that was helpful, to say your stroke is my stroke, that this is not just your thing, that this is ours.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we do that?
Well, and it's, it can be difficult when you switch from a husband and wife role or a spousal role or whatever that relationship is to patient caregiver. Many times we find that people lose that spousal role. They lose that partnership. And this is what brought you together in the first place. And so you touched on creating a team and having people who can come in and take some of the responsibilities off of the caregiver. And one of the things that allows is not only for the caregiver to have time for themselves, but also for the patient and the caregiver to resume a piece of that partner role and that spousal role, so that not every interaction has to be about patient caregiver. But you can do things like, have a date night, watch a movie, do something or play a game together, something that you enjoyed prior to this as your role as a partner, so that not everything has to be about the stroke or the spinal cord injury or the recovery process. Like, get back to that thing that brought you together in the first place.
As much of the business of life. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's interesting when you say it, too, is I had I know I shared that in my role as a caregiver in our situation, I had generally just moved to the area. And so I had no support system. I had no family, no friends. And not that people didn't care, but they were so far away.
Right.
So, and I think that's the case for many, in some way, shape, or form. And so, and I'm a spouse that worked full time. Mm-hmm. And then had my practice. And so, and I was working in a hospital setting where I was working 14-hour shifts. So, I was, and that wasn't negotiable. Right. I needed to have my income. And so, I can just talk to a piece of, how do you even create a team when you have nothing? Mm-hmm. Where do you start? And it takes a lot of creativity, but actually finding just one thing that I was able to do, which was, and you talk to when your loved one is in the hospital, or in a setting in which they're getting complete support. And so and unfortunately, based on whether it's the state of insurance or how to set up services, there's not a lot of runway for that. It's very complex. And so not all of those, often all those pieces are not in place when the loved one comes home. So now as a caregiver, you have to be so present. But backing up out of that was how to get creative. And I think about this transportation piece, because our loved one needs to go to therapies and we can't always be there. We're not able to do that. Or maybe we just need to do some self-care, go to the gym or exercise or spend time with a friend. And so instead of dropping that piece, we can try to set up something on the team. And I did find somebody who actually was unable to work themselves, and they had lost meaning in their lives essentially, and they were if you will, very sad about their situation, but they were able to drive. And so I was able to enlist their help for transportation for a small fee, which was significantly less than what it cost to use a transportation company. And it was a win-win.
Yep.
This individual made meaning in their life. They were on a regular schedule, so it got them out of the house. It got my loved one where he needed to be regularly, and it was one of the ways I thought, okay, as a caregiver, I cannot do this all. I mean, in some cases, caregivers even want to, but they can't. They have an obligation somewhere else, and so we can look within the community to as much as we possibly can. Every single time somebody says, "How can I help?" I really mean that. And in the caregiving role, we're so in deep, we're like, I can't even think. And so we say, no, I can't. I know you're there, Mom, but I can't even think because my head is so full. So having that list is really helpful, because as soon as they say, how can I help you, go right here. Which one of these things do you want?
Yep.
And quite honestly, I think sometimes people aren't prepared for that. It's like, well,
oh, wait, you actually want me to do something?
What part of this can you do? Can you do this once a week? Because we can't do it all, and we shouldn't do it all.
Yeah.
It's just not possible. We take on that unrealistic burden, and as a result, we end up with guilt and shame. So it's part of this whole acceptance piece of how do we allow that support? How do we ask for that help? And how do we get comfortable with letting our loved one do as much as they can?
Yeah.
I mean, for my loved one, it created a relationship he never had with somebody. It gave him a new friend. It gave him somebody to talk to. I mean, it really was just the two of us. So if I wasn't home, it was the four walls.
Yeah.
And that can be very difficult, And so I was able to ease my burden by knowing that he had something safe and he had something positive, and it wasn't all about me. It can't for us. So and again, I think it's so important to talk with a mental health professional through this, because we're so close, we can't see it.
Yeah.
As caregivers, it's just so we're just so close to the role, and we can still be close, and we can still be that primary person, but just do it in a way where it doesn't inspire, or it doesn't bring feelings of constant guilt and overwhelm, because because it's overwhelming from the start. So if we don't learn to back up quickly, we go further in. I call it's like a big knot of getting tangled. It's already tangled, and it gets more and more tangled. And we start with a very bad script in our head, like you said, of nobody else can really do this. Nobody else really knows my loved one. Well, those things may be true, but it's not true that nobody else can do it. We have to be able to give that piece up and say, there's this acceptance piece again. Yeah. Understanding that our loved one's recovery, it doesn't squarely fall on our shoulders.
Yeah.
That we're part of the story. We're not the whole story.
Yep. This is sort of going on to a slightly different topic, but another big issue that often comes up, and I would say it's universally true, but especially when someone has a right brain stroke that affects the left side of their body, one of the things that often goes along with this right brain stroke is a lack of insight or ability to understand what someone else is going through. And this is not a character flaw. This is something that is a symptom of this stroke. And so I see it especially in couples or in patient-caregiver relationships where someone has had a right brain stroke. But I would say it's also universally true that people who are recovering from something feel like their caregivers don't know how hard it is for them and how much they've lost and what they're going through. And the flip side of that is caregivers will say, this person doesn't appreciate how much I'm doing for them, how hard I'm working, how much I want for them to be better, how much I want for them to not be going through this. And so there, we know there is scientific evidence that when something, a major life health crisis like a stroke or a spinal cord injury or traumatic brain injury happen, it can have a very negative effect on relationships, so much so that divorce rates are higher and that sort of thing. How can we help and support the relationship side of things so that each can understand or be more empathetic about where the other person is in this process?
Yeah, it's a really good point. It really is. And again, because we feel like, in both roles that we're walking our piece alone.
Mm-hmm.
So communication is key and empathy is key. That ability to say, I'm not having your experience. I really don't know your experience, but I can understand from my experience what struggle feels like.
Yeah.
And so if I'm struggling, and you tell me you're struggling, I can understand that just from a struggle piece. And communication is key. Again, I think, that we speak to this cognitive piece of how much can our loved one really understand. And for those who really can't, it can be very difficult because they truly can't. But that doesn't mean we can't share from a communication standpoint very basic concepts that possibly somebody could grasp. And so I think when we look at that, it's communication. It's being able to really set up from the beginning a conversation about, let's talk about how we both feel about this. Let's see if we can't try to understand, even though we're having different experiences here, that we can make this conversation of how do we make space for each other.
Mm-hmm.
How do we communicate out our needs? And so I think, again, working through that with somebody who can help the conversation.
Yeah.
If it's not there before, again, a lot of what happens in the caregiver role is reflective of the relationship before the loved one's event, and so if we were struggling with communication then or empathy, it only heightens in this. And so it is a conversation that I think we need help with on how to talk to our loved one and how, as again, the affected individual talks to their loved one about, let me share my experience of what's happening here and all my emotions, my difficult emotions and my challenges, so that I can lay this out for you. And I want to hear how you feel, mm-hmm. vice versa. And so, and sometimes, writing things down can be helpful in that communication for, these are the things I'm feeling. These are the things you're feeling. Look where we match in our frustrations and fears. And so I can understand your fear because I have my own fear. And so communication is key. Yes. Yeah. And that empathic piece to say to our loved one, I can see this is frustrating for you. I can see you're overwhelmed. I know this is difficult. I recognize that because I feel that too. And it's okay to feel those things, but let's figure out how to do this, how to keep talking, how to communicate, how to support one another. You support me, I'll support you. Communication is key. Yeah.
And unfortunately, many times where this comes to a head is in the middle of our therapy sessions, which is fine, except that that's not what I do. That's not where my skills are. It's not that I don't want to help. I absolutely do. It's just I'm not the right person to do it. And so we often find ourselves in the PTOT speech rehab realm referring people to mental health.
Yeah.
But we also often meet a lot of resistance in taking that next step.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's stigma. I don't know if it's, that's just one more thing to fit into our schedule and we don't have time for this, or, I don't know. But I can't tell you how often we recommend to people, you really need to get some counseling.
Sure.
And sometimes it's to the patient, sometimes it's to the caregiver, sometimes we say, y'all need to go together, but it is often met with some resistance. And so I think one of the things that we strive to do is really to destigmatize and to help people understand how much better your life can be if you learn to communicate, if you learn to take time for yourself, if you learn to allow others in to help you.
Yeah.
And so it is, mental health is such a big piece of all of our lives, but particularly in this journey of recovery and caregiving. And I hope that through this presentation, we will have inspired someone to seek out that help for themselves, and that
Yeah.
we would have had an opportunity to empower someone to say, I need this, and to take that next step to do it, because it is so important. And recovery is really not a process that anyone can go through alone, whether you are the one caregiving or you are the one recovering. And you're right, it's our journey. It takes a village, and just like it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a village to recover from a serious medical event like this.
I appreciate you sharing that, because I think you're right on when you say there's stigma, and that's so unfortunate. Because, and I think when we talk about, hey, talk to a counselor, there's immediate thought that, oh my gosh, there's something wrong with me.
Right.
You're telling me I can't handle, not you're telling me, but there's an implication that I can't handle that something's wrong with me. And I really would love us to be able to shift the conversation into the fact that there's nothing wrong with you, that everyone needs support, that what counselors can provide is a place to process your emotions, that it isn't about what's wrong with you that needs to be fixed. It provides an environment and a relationship in which you can really process that range of emotions and talk with somebody who is objective to help you through that. It doesn't mean that, as a matter of fact, getting involved in the counseling process and working with somebody is a sign of strength, not a sign of weakness. Yep. That it doesn't necessarily mean something's wrong. It just means it's a level of support. It is a relationship that is wholly yours. I mean, and I say this to my clients, here it is. Here's the environment. You can cry, you can scream. I prefer you not throw things, but if you have to with a pillow, we need a place to process. And so it's not about what's wrong. It's about what can be right. It's not that you can't handle it. It's that we all need support. And so it's a healthful thing to do.
Yep.
And I have, in my work with caregivers, I and it is true, many of us don't come for help until we're way at the edge. And it's we don't have to go that far in, but if you are that far in, a counselor can help you walk your way out of it, to stabilize your own emotions. We often talk about how we're triggered and how we're becoming more irritated or agitated, or becoming, if you will, I hear often, I'm becoming somebody I don't like. And okay, so that doesn't mean you're bad. It just means that you haven't been getting enough support for that. You're so close in that you can't see it. So working with somebody is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength, and it doesn't mean something's wrong with you. It's a learning experience. Yeah. It can be educational. It can be a way to understand that the experiences that you're having are normal, and that here's how to deal with it. And so it is that stigma that keeps people from coming, and that is an unfortunate situation, because we all need that. Yeah. All of us. I mean, and there's no shame in it. And we kind of go back to this guilt and shame piece. Well, the guilt of, I shouldn't need to talk to a counselor. I should be able to do this. And then we start judging ourselves and shaming ourselves. And so I must say that, those caregivers who I work with who get that support do tend to do better. Yep. In their everyday lives. And how they feel about themselves and their relationship with their loved one. And it's something that it's truly a gift you give yourself. It's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's also important to note that sometimes people have a more resistant or negative response to the suggestion of seeking out counseling or mental health, because they have done it in the past and either felt like it didn't work for them, or they didn't like the person that they were working with. And I think it's important that everyone know that you're not obligated to stick with one person. You know, if you start in this therapeutic relationship and you find that it's not therapeutic, it's perfectly acceptable to part ways with that counselor and find a different one. I mean, it is
Absolutely.
so important to find someone that you can connect with and that
Absolutely.
you feel like is actually helping you on this journey. And if you're with someone or you have had that experience in the past where it didn't work, it doesn't mean that you can't be helped or that mental health counseling doesn't work. It just means that the person that you were with was not the right person for you.
That is such an important point, and I'm glad that you brought it up because the counseling relationship is everything is about the relationship, and so it's much different than really when we see most medical providers. We're passing through, generally, and it's a different relationship. I can't tell you how many people, come to me and say, I was in therapy, but I stopped because I just wasn't feeling it, or the person didn't get me. And most people don't know that they can just, yeah. And actually, as providers, I am trained that if it doesn't work, let me help you find that person. Let me provide some resources for you, or let me direct you in places you might be able to. That our number one goal is that you get that relationship and that support. But yeah, you're right. Most people don't know, and if they've had, perhaps they've been in therapy for another issue in their life, and so they may think, well, this is what I would go for, and it only looks like this if I had this.
Right.
That's what I know. And it's not, because it's not about just one thing.
Right.
And you are absolutely right. It is about the relationship. And there are those that work directly with caregivers who have a level of expanded knowledge. It doesn't mean that any counselor can't be helpful.
Right.
But it can be helpful if there's that additional piece. And they're out there. They're absolutely out there. So you're right. If it's about the relationship, and it's important to have that relationship.
Yeah.
So incredibly important. And I've seen caregivers honestly thrive in their role when they get that support, when they have a place to come every week where it's like, okay, here's my problem. Here's what happened this week. Here's where I'm really stuck. How do I get past this frustration? How do I get past every time this happens? I want to scream and I want to yell and I find myself doing things. Or how do I manage the guilt that he's not getting better or she's not progressing or I can't inspire them to do this thing? How do I handle my range of emotions that I feel? How do I take care of myself? And it is such a joy when I see somebody who is struggling, who is not anymore, or not it.
And I'm so glad that you brought it around to that to kind of close out this discussion, because I feel like we really emphasized the struggles and the difficulties and the stress of being a caregiver. And it is so important to recognize that it doesn't have to be that way all the time, that there are strategies, there are ways to make this a very rewarding and hopeful and positive relationship. That sometimes it's just a matter of getting the right strategies, getting the right support, getting the right education, so that this is not a miserable relationship. This is a very positive and productive and therapeutic relationship for everyone.
Yes.
And so I definitely want to leave on that note of hope and positivity, that being a caregiver can be incredibly rewarding, whether you asked for the job or not.
Right.
But when one succeeds, all succeed, and we can all rejoice in all of our successes down the road. And so on that note, I wanted to say that we do have, as part of our resource library, a list of mental health professionals. So if anyone watching this is looking for someone who's interested, we definitely have some providers that we have either have been recommended to us or that we've worked with in the past. But Joanne, I so appreciate your time, and I wanted to give you an opportunity now to say, how do people find you if they've watched this presentation and they say, you know what, I really need mental health, I really kind of like this Joanne person, how do I find her?
Yeah, I'd be happy to share that information. As you said, it's all listed at the end of the presentation. But I'm very easily found through the internet. You can type in Blue Sky Counseling Services in Apex, North Carolina, and my practice and name should come up. If not, if you put my name in there, which is Joanne Lisa, or even Blue Sky Counseling, you may get another reference to my profile on a website called Psychology Today, where there's my picture and my information about how I work and who I work with. And I do provide a 15-minute or 30-minute free consultation, depending, on what we need to talk about. We can do it by phone or we can do it face-to-face. And so we can talk about your individual struggles and what you feel like you need help on and how I can help. And so we can do that beforehand. And I really welcome that, everyone to explore that. And so those are the two main ways to find me. My office is accessible by most major highways in the Triangle area. And right now I'm doing telehealth due to COVID-19, but I should be back in the office just as soon as it's safe. And so, folks can get started now. There's not a need to wait for a face-to-face. It's working very well. And so I invite that. So those are the two primary ways to find me, but primarily on the internet.
Yeah. And of course, we'll have the presentation linked, and I've already, on the original presentation from Tuesday, in the comments, I put a link to your website and a link to the contacts page on your website so that people can click on that link and it'll directly go to the place where they can enter their name and email and phone number and send you a message right through your website. Yes. So that you can also then reach back out to them. So.
And I am happy to, if I can just say, I'm very happy to, if, even if somebody doesn't feel like they are ready for counseling right now and want that support, if there's something that came up in the presentation that, someone would like to know more about, hey, how do I find support groups, or how do I do this? I'm happy to answer that question. My goal is for people to get support and get what they need. And so even if we're not working together, based on the presentation for caregivers, and in all honesty, those who are in recovery, not just caregivers but I do support and I do counsel folks who have had, an event. Mm-hmm. Again, whether it's a stroke or a brain injury or some such, that I also work with people through that process, through their own emotional situation and grief and loss. And so I'm happy to answer questions. I want to be a resource.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time and your expertise and your heart. We really appreciate it. I know our caregivers out there who are watching this appreciate it. And we welcome any questions, comments, feedback. Please reach out to me, reach out to Joanne. And we look forward to hearing from you and helping you on this journey. So with that, I am going to click over here to my Facebook and end our live video. See you all later.
Thank you, Katie.